Welcome. I am your host, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey. Today we're talking about the last letter from Ravenscourt, but before we start, let me know where you're watching from and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about. Chapter 1. A letter arrives at Baker Street. It was on a grey Tuesday morning in the third week of November that the letter arrived, and with it the particular electricity that only a genuine mystery can produce in a man of Sherlock Holmes's constitution. I had come down to our Baker Street rooms somewhat later than usual, having spent the previous evening at my club, and found the fire there more agreeable than I had expected. Holmes, I discovered upon descending, had been awake for some considerable time before me. The sitting room bore all the familiar evidence of a mind in acute and restless distress. The Persian slipper had been emptied of tobacco twice over, judging by the state of the grate. 3 different newspapers had been opened, read, and discarded with what I imagined had been steadily mounting contempt. And the violin, which Holmes had taken up the previous evening with every sign of genuine inspiration, now lay across the settee at an angle that suggested it had been set down in the middle of a phrase and not returned to since. Holmes himself was standing at the window in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, looking down at Baker Street with the expression of a general surveying terrain from which his army has already withdrawn. "You slept well," he said, without turning. "Tolerably," I replied, moving toward the coffee pot. "And you did not sleep at all, I suspect." "Sleep is a thief that robs a man of the only hours worth having," he said, though without his usual precision of conviction. He was restless. 3 days, I knew, had now elapsed since the conclusion of the Milverton business, and the interval had been unkind to him. Holmes in idleness was a different creature entirely from Holmes in motion, drawn inward, caustic at the edges, and prone to what I can only describe as a kind of brilliant gloom that made the rooms feel considerably smaller than their dimensions warranted. I poured my coffee, settled into my armchair, and reached for the Morning Post, which Mrs. Hudson had left in her customary arrangement on the side table. There were 3 items: a bill from my tailor, which I set aside with the stoicism of experience, a note from my publisher about nothing of consequence, and a third envelope which I did not recognise. It had been forwarded, that much was plain. The outer address, in a careful solicitor's hand, bore a Bath postmark and was directed to me personally, with a note appended in the same hand. Forwarded at the request of Miss C. Pembridge, who has reason to believe Dr. Watson may convey this matter to the attention of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The inner envelope, which the solicitor had evidently enclosed without opening, was sealed with a simple pressed circle of red wax. No crest, no device, and the hand upon it was a woman's, clear and educated, but with a quality of urgency in the pressure of the pen that was visible even before one broke the seal. "Holmes," I said. "There is something here that may interest you." He turned from the window. Something in my voice, or perhaps in the posture of a man who has abruptly recognised that his morning is no longer ordinary, communicated itself to him immediately. He was across the room in 3 strides and had the letter from my hand before I had properly offered it. He did not open it at once. He held it, turned it, examined the outer forwarding envelope, weighed it between 2 fingers, and pressed it gently along its edges. Then he broke the seal and read. I watched his face. It is an occupation I have had considerable practice in, and I am better at it than he sometimes credits, though I confess that what one sees in Holmes's face during the reading of a compelling document is less emotion than its careful, disciplined suppression. His grey eyes moved across the page with swift precision. He read it once, then, a rarer occurrence, returned to the beginning and read it again. When he lowered the letter, his expression had changed in a way that I recognised well. The gloom had lifted. In its place was something alert and sharp, and almost, I would not say happy, for that is not quite the word, but satisfied, as a blade is satisfied when it finds the particular thing it was made to cut. "Read it," he said, and handed it to me. The letter was brief and the more affecting for its brevity. The The writer identified herself as Miss Clara Pembridge, of an address she gave as temporary in Bath. Her father, Sir Edmund Pembridge of Ravenscourt Manor in Sussex, had died 3 weeks previously. The inquest had returned a verdict of accidental death. He had fallen from the parapet of the estate's ancient tower late at night, apparently having climbed there alone, and the ground below had allowed no survival of the fall. The local constabulary was satisfied. The coroner was satisfied. Her uncle, Lord Aldous Pembridge, her father's elder brother, who now stood to inherit the estate, was conducting himself with becoming gravity. She was not satisfied. She wrote clearly, without the melodrama I might have expected from a daughter in distress, and that restraint gave her words considerably more weight. She had, she explained, received a letter from her father approximately 5 weeks before his death. She would not transcribe it in full, but its essential character was cold, formal, even dismissive, or as suggesting that the estrangement between them, which she acknowledged had existed, was now permanent, and that her father wished no further correspondence. It had devastated her. She had not written back. Then, after his death, among his papers, the household had found a second letter, undated, but placed on his writing desk, evidently composed and perhaps never sent. This letter was warm, reconciling, written in the unmistakable voice of a father who still loved his daughter and wished above all things to repair what had broken between them. It contradicted the cold letter entirely, in tone, in sentiment, in every quality that can distinguish one man's writing from another's. "Mr. Holmes," she wrote, and I noted that she addressed him directly in the letter's final passage, as though she had known all along who its ultimate reader must be. "I am not a woman given to sensational explanations. I do not say my father was murdered. I say only that one of these 2 letters was not written by him, and that if one was forged I do not know which, and I do not know why, and I do not know who would have the motive or the means. I know only that my father is dead, and that the last letter I received from him told me he wished never to hear from me again, and that I now believe with everything in my power that he never wrote those words. I am asking you, sir, to come to Ravenscourt and tell me whether I am a grieving woman constructing comfort where none exists, or whether something has been done to my father and to me that the law has not yet perceived." I set the letter down. The fire crackled. Outside, as a hansom cab clattered through the wet street. "Well," I said. "Yes," said Holmes. He had already moved to the mantelpiece and was reaching for his pipe. The contradiction in correspondence is, as she quite rightly identifies, the heart of it. One letter warm, one letter cold, both purportedly from the same hand in the same period to the same correspondent. There is no innocent explanation for that, Watson. A man does not write to his estranged daughter twice in a month, once to rebuff her permanently and once to seek her forgiveness, without the 2 letters representing entirely incompatible states of mind, separated by a transformation that would take considerably more than a few weeks. Unless he was genuinely undecided, I offered. A man in distress might write one letter and then... "Might write one and send the other," Holmes said, cutting across me without discourtesy. "That is a possibility, but she says the warm letter was found on his desk, unsent, or perhaps unsendable. The cold letter was received by her in Bath. If a man writes 2 letters, one warm and one cold, and sends only the cold one, we are asked to believe he sat down to compose an act of reconciliation, completed it, and then posted the crueler document instead. That is not impossible, Watson, but it is—" He paused, struck a match. "Psychologically baroque. I prefer the simpler explanation, which is that one of the letters was not written by Edmund Pembridge at all." He drew on his pipe with an expression of quiet, precise pleasure. "The question of which one is, at this stage, rather more interesting than it might appear. If the warm letter is the forgery, the object was to produce posthumous evidence of a reconciliation that never occurred, a sentimental fabrication perhaps, by someone who loved the old man and wished his daughter to believe herself forgiven, a gentle crime. if crime it is. He looked at me over the pipe. But if the cold letter is the forgery, if someone put into Clara Pembridge's hands a document designed to keep her away from her father in the weeks before his death, then we are in considerably darker water. He set his pipe on the mantelpiece with the deliberation of a man who has arrived at a decision. "There is an afternoon train to Lewes," he said. "I believe it departs at 2:30. You will want to pack for at least 3 days. Watson, Sussex in November requires a more considered wardrobe than you generally bring to these occasions. And you might ask Mrs. Hudson to send a telegram to Miss Pembridge's solicitor in Bath, confirming that we will attend at Ravenscourt by evening." I looked at him. "You've decided then?" Holmes had already moved toward his bedroom. "A man is dead," he said over his shoulder. "His daughter has received what she believes to be his last words, and she does not believe they were his. That is not a matter to leave in the hands of a county coroner, however conscientious." He paused in the doorway. "Besides," and here something entered his voice that I recognised as the closest he generally comes to admitting enthusiasm, "whoever composed that cold letter, Watson, knew both the handwriting and the emotional architecture of a family estrangement well enough to make it convincing to the people who knew Edmund Pembridge best. That is not the work of an amateur. This will be worth the journey." The telegram was sent. The bags were packed. By 2:00 we were in a cab bound for Victoria. The letter folded in Holmes's breast pocket, the grey November sky pressing down on London as though the city were a thing to be kept under glass. I thought, as I watched the streets thin into terraces and the terraces into the particular dreariness of the city's southern approaches, about the tower at Ravenscourt, which I had not yet seen, but which I already somehow imagined. Tall, old, standing against a dark sky with the parapet that had been the last thing Edmund Pembridge's hands had touched. A man climbs a tower alone at night for one of two reasons, in my experience. Either he wishes to be above the world for a time, or he has already decided to leave it. Holmes, as though following the same thread, said without preamble, "He was not a careless man." "What makes you say so?" Clara's letter, the care of the prose, the precision of the specifics. She is her father's daughter. That much is apparent. Men of that formation do not stumble from parapets. He was quiet for a moment. "They may, however, be brought to them." I had nothing to say to that. The cab rolled on through the grey afternoon, toward Victoria, toward Sussex, toward a dead man's tower, and the last letter that had been written in his name. Asterisk. Chapter 2. Ravenscourt in November. We reached Lewes as the last of the daylight was failing. The journey south had been passed largely in silence. Holmes in his corner of the carriage with his eyes closed, and his fingertips pressed together in the attitude of prayer that signified, in his case, not devotion, but the most intense and private species of thought. I had read, or attempted to read, but found my attention drifting repeatedly to the window and the landscape darkening beyond it. The Weald giving way to the gentler rolls of the Sussex Downs, the villages growing smaller and further apart, the sky acquiring that particular quality of November dusk in the English countryside, which is less a fading of light than a slow, deliberate withdrawal of it, as though the day has decided to leave without ceremony. A trap was waiting for us at the station, sent from Ravenscourt. The driver, a weathered man of few words and considerable moustache, offered no conversation beyond confirming our destination, and we rode the remaining 4 miles in the kind of companionable, rural silence that I have always found more restful than any amount of urban noise. Holmes had opened his eyes when we changed from train to trap, and he was watching the road with the attentive stillness of a man who understands that a landscape, read correctly, is as informative as any document. Ravenscourt announced itself before we saw it. There was the smell first, wood smoke and wet stone and something older underneath, the particular cold exhalation of a house that has stood long enough to develop its own atmosphere, independent of weather or season. Then the gates, iron and tall, with a crest worked into the scrollwork that I could not make out in the dark. Then the drive, lined with beeches whose stripped November branches made an arch overhead like the ribs of some enormous creature, and through them, at the end of the approach, the house itself. It was not the house I noticed first. It was the tower. It rose from the east wing. Not a decorative addition, but something older than the main structure. A remnant of whatever had stood on this ground before the current manor had been built around and against it. It was perhaps 60 feet at its highest point, square-built from dark stone that had grown darker still with centuries of weather, and it stood against the pale remnant of the sky like a reproach. I found myself counting the floors by the narrow windows, and when I reached the top and imagined the parapet, lo, I thought, for a man standing at the edge, I looked away. Holmes said nothing, but he had seen it. We were received at the door by a housekeeper of the substantial and quietly authoritative variety that large country houses seem to produce as reliably as they produce damp in the cellars. She identified herself as Mrs. Alderton, conveyed us through an entrance hall hung with portraits of Pembridges in chronological recession, the earlier ones more interesting faces, I noted, than the later, and deposited us in a drawing-room where a fire had been lit against the November chill with more efficiency than warmth. Clara Pembridge was waiting. She was younger than I had imagined from her letter, perhaps 28, with dark eyes that bore the particular exhaustion of someone who has been sleeping poorly, not from grief alone, but from the more corrosive sleeplessness of uncertainty. She was dressed plainly and held herself with the composed uprightness of a woman who has decided that visible distress will not serve her. She thanked us for coming with a directness I found immediately admirable, and then Aldous Pembridge entered from the far door, and the character of the room changed in a way that was difficult to define, but impossible to miss. He was, by any objective measure, a distinguished-looking man, 60 or near it, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the ease of manner that comes not from effort, but from a lifetime of occupying rooms as though they have been arranged around him. He welcomed Holmes with precisely the right degree of cordiality, warm enough to avoid discourtesy, measured enough to convey that he considered the entire exercise somewhat beneath the dignity of the situation. He shook my hand with the confident grip of a man who has nothing to conceal and knows it. "My niece," he said, with a fractional glance toward Clara, "has been greatly distressed by Edmund's death, as we all have been. I hope, Mr. Holmes, that your visit, whatever it may reveal, will ultimately give her some peace." "That," said Holmes pleasantly, "is precisely what I intend." It was only later, reviewing the exchange in my notes, that I realised how completely Holmes had declined to agree with the premise of what Aldous had said. The letters were produced after dinner, or rather, after the performance of dinner, which was a strained and careful occasion conducted largely in the language of weather and county affairs. Clara brought them herself, a leather portfolio that she set on the table between herself and Holmes, with a precision that suggested she had been guarding it. Holmes took them without hurry, carried them to the lamp, and began to examine them in a silence so complete that I could hear the fire and, distantly, the November wind finding its way around the eaves of the old house. I watched him, and tried to see what he saw. The two letters were, to my eye, remarkably similar in hand. The same slant, the same weight of pen, the same formation of the capital letters that I associated with the educated masculine hand of a man of Edmund's generation. But Holmes was not looking at the handwriting, or not only at the handwriting. He was looking, I noticed, at the seals. Each letter had been opened naturally and the wax was broken, but the fragments remained affixed to the paper. Holmes examined them at close range through his lens, moving from one to the other and back again, with the expression of a chess player who has just seen 3 moves ahead and is carefully verifying that the board supports what his mind has already concluded. "Clara," he said. He had moved to first names with the quiet presumption of a man who considers formality an obstacle in matters of importance. "These letters. Did your father always seal his correspondence?" "Always," she said. "It was a habit from... He was particular about it. He had a seal press that had belonged to his father, an heirloom piece. And you would recognise it? I would. I grew up watching him use it. She paused. The impression was never quite even. One side always pressed a little heavier than the other. There was something slightly worn about the device, I think. My grandfather had dropped it at some point in his life, and it was never quite the same after. Holmes set the lens down on the table. He said nothing, but I saw his expression, and I recognised it. The particular quality of a man who has just confirmed something he already suspected, and found the confirmation rather more significant than he had allowed himself to hope. I looked at the sealed fragments myself, after Holmes had turned away to ask Clara about the dates. The cold letter, the one received in Bath, had a wax impression that was clean and even and perfectly centred. The warm letter, found on Edmund's desk, had an impression that was fractionally heavier on the left, with the slight asymmetry of an old press long used by a careful hand. Holmes had already moved on. He was standing at the bookshelf along the far wall, his back to the room, with the unhurried attention of a man browsing, which meant, as I had learned over many years, that he was doing the opposite of browsing. "Edmund kept a diary?" he asked. "He did," said Clara. "He had kept one for 30 years. It is on the second shelf. He always kept it in the same place." Holmes extracted the diary, a substantial volume in green calfskin, and opened it with the same deliberate care he applied to everything. He turned pages forward, then back, then forward again. Then he held it, spine upward, at a slight angle to the lamp. "Watson," he said, "come and look at this." I crossed to him. He tilted the diary so that the lamplight fell along the gutter of the binding at a low angle, and I saw immediately what he meant. The slight but unmistakable unevenness at the inner margin of certain pages, a roughness that was not age or wear but the clean resistance of paper that has been cut away. Several pages, I estimated perhaps a dozen or 14, had been removed from the diary's interior. Of the removed pages, Holmes said quietly to Clara, "Can you tell, from the entries before and after the gap, what period they covered?" She looked. She was quick. She had her father's mind, I thought. "The last entry before the gap is the 14th of September, she said. "The first entry after it is the 30th. She looked up. "A fortnight." "Yes," said Holmes. "A fortnight." He closed the diary and set it back on the shelf with the careful precision of a man replacing evidence rather than a book. "I wonder what occupied your father during those 14 days. He said it as though it were a general observation, but his eyes, when he turned from the shelf, were not the eyes of a man wondering. They were the eyes of a man who has already formed an answer and is reserving it for the appropriate moment. Aldous Pembridge rejoined us at 9:30, apparently having spent the interval in the estate's study on correspondence. He moved through the drawing-room with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his inheritance, which I noted with the thought that Holmes had already placed in my mind it now was. He expressed polite interest in whether Holmes had found anything useful, in the tone of a man who expects the answer to be no. "A beginning," said Holmes. "Nothing more. A house like Ravenscourt rewards patience, I find." Aldous smiled. "I hope your patience is rewarded with a conclusion that allows my niece some rest," he said. "We all have been greatly affected." "Of course," said Holmes. He said it warmly, agreeably, and with the absolute neutrality of a man who has already made up his mind about the person he's speaking to, and is simply waiting for the correct moment to say so. I lay awake that night in my room at Ravenscourt, listening to the wind work at the old windows and thinking about a tower I had not yet climbed, a diary with a fortnight cut out of it, and 2 wax seals, one imperfect, one flawless, that had begun to tell a story considerably more troubling than the one the coroner had heard. Down the corridor I knew, Holmes was not sleeping either. But where my wakefulness was the wakefulness of a man unsettled, his, I suspected, was the wakefulness of a mind in motion, following the thread of something it had already, in its quick and relentless way, begun to understand. Outside, the tower stood against the November sky. It had stood for 500 years and would stand for 500 more, indifferent to what had happened at its foot. Towers built for grandeur, I had thought on the train, have a habit of becoming monuments to grief. I understood now, looking at its shadow on my wall where the moonlight caught the edge of the casement, that I had been more nearly right than I knew. Asterisk. Chapter 3. A question of inheritance. Morning came to Ravenscourt with the reluctant grey light of a November that had decided firmly against any concession to brightness. I dressed early and found Holmes already at the breakfast table, which was unusual enough to be notable, and as Holmes's relationship with conventional mealtimes was at best theoretical, with a cup of coffee cooling untouched at his elbow, and a folded sheet of paper before him, on which he had been writing in his small, precise hand. He looked up when I entered, assessed me with the swift glance that served him in place of a good morning, and returned to his paper. "Sit down, Watson. I want to think aloud, and you are the only audience I find useful for the purpose." I sat, helped myself to eggs and toast from the sideboard, and waited. Holmes set his pen down, pressed his fingertips together, and looked at the middle distance with the focused vacancy of a man examining something visible only to himself. "We have," he said, "the following. A man is dead. The death was ruled accidental, a fall from a tower at night, apparently alone. Apparently the act of a man who climbed there for reasons the coroner either could not or did not wish to examine too closely. His daughter believes the letter she received from him in the weeks before his death was not written by him. She has good reason for this belief, which I am now in a position to confirm. The seal on the cold letter is a forgery." He paused. "The question I am now required to answer is not whether something was done to Edmund Pembridge. I am satisfied that something was. The question is what, and by whom, and why." "The why," I said, "seems likely to involve the estate." "Everything in this house involves the estate," Holmes said. "Ravenscourt is worth, conservatively, £40,000 in property and land, to say nothing of the income. Edmund was the younger brother, but he held the title and the house by virtue of a settlement arrangement made by their father. Aldous received a substantial income but no property, which means that upon Edmund's death, under the normal operation of inheritance, Aldous inherits everything, unless Edmund had made other arrangements." Holmes looked at me steadily. "Which I suspect he had. We need the solicitor, Watson, a man named Graves, in the village. I intend to pay him a call this morning." The village of Ravenscourt Cross was 1.5 miles from the estate by the road, less by the footpath that cut across the lower meadow and through a stand of ash trees that had shed their leaves entirely and stood in the wet morning air like a congregation of grey penitents. Holmes walked quickly and in silence, his coat collar turned up against the cold, his eyes on the path with the absent attention of a man whose mind is elsewhere and trusts his feet to manage without it. Mr. Silas Graves occupied a small office above the post office, reached by a staircase that creaked in a way that presumably announced every client's arrival long before they knocked. He was a compact man of perhaps 55, with the slightly compressed quality of someone accustomed to fitting himself into spaces, both physical and social, that were not quite large enough. He had sharp eyes behind steel-rimmed spectacles, and the manner of a man who has spent his professional life in the careful management of other people's affairs and has developed, in consequence, a fine instinct for when those affairs are about to become inconvenient. He was already inconvenienced when we arrived. I could see it in the set of his shoulders and the way he arranged his hands on the desk with slightly too much deliberateness, as though he had been practising a posture of innocence before we came up the stairs. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I had heard you were at Ravenscourt. I wondered whether you would call." "Then you have saved us both the preamble," said Holmes pleasantly, settling into the chair across the desk with the ease of a man who has already decided how the conversation will go. "Tell me about the will." Graves was quiet for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to confirm that he had one. "There are," he said carefully, "2 wills." Holmes said nothing. He had a gift, which I had observed many times, for the strategic deployment of silence, the recognition that a man who is already inclined to speak requires only the absence of interruption, and that any question asked too soon risks narrowing the answer. Graves set his spectacles on the desk, polished them with a cloth, replaced them. A man buying time. The earlier will, he said, was drawn up 11 years ago. Under its terms, the Ravenscourt estate, the London property, and the majority of Sir Edmund's assets passed to Lord Aldous Pembridge as next of kin, with a modest provision for Miss Clara. And the later will, said Holmes. Another pause. Sir Edmund consulted me 8 months ago. I gathered there had been a reconciliation of sorts with his daughter, or the beginning of one. He wished to revise the settlement substantially. Under the new document, Miss Clara inherits the estate in its entirety. Lord Aldous would retain his income and the London property, but Ravenscourt itself, the house, the land, everything attached to it, would pass to her. And this new will, said Holmes very quietly, where does it stand? Graves removed his spectacles again and set them on the desk with a small, precise click. Sir Edmund took the signed copy away with him to complete the formal filing. It was never returned. I have my own draft copy and the witness documentation, but the signed original, the document that would make it legally definitive, was, apparently, among his papers at Ravenscourt at the time of his death. He paused. I have made inquiries. It has not been found. The fire in Graves's small office ticked and settled. Outside, a cart moved through the village street below, and I was aware of Holmes beside me, absolutely still in a way that in a less composed man would have looked like shock, but in him looked like the moment before a mechanism engages. So under the current legal position, I said slowly, following the arithmetic, the estate passes to Aldous. Under the current legal position, Graves agreed. Yes, the earlier will stands. I've advised Miss Clara that the witness documentation may support a challenge, but it would be contested, and the outcome is not certain. Holmes stood. He buttoned his coat with the unhurried movements of a man who has what he came for and sees no reason to remain. One more question, Mr. Graves. The argument you had with Edmund, witnessed by the household, I understand, in the week before his death. What was it about? The quality of Graves's discomfort changed. It became less the discomfort of a man with a professional secret and more the discomfort of a man with a personal one. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he spoke with the air of someone releasing a weight he has been carrying for too long. Sir Edmund discovered an irregularity in the estate accounts, he said. A series of small withdrawals over a number of years which had not been... He stopped, resumed. I had borrowed, Mr. Holmes, against my expectation of fees. The amounts were not large individually, but accumulated they were significant. Edmund had found them. He was angry. The argument your witnesses heard was him informing me of the discovery and me, asking for his forbearance. And did he forbear? He was considering it. He was a fair man. A pause. He was a better man than I deserved. Holmes looked at him for a moment with an expression that I could not entirely read, somewhere between assessment and something that might, in a different context, have been sympathy. I have no interest in your arrangements with your former client, he said. They are not germane to what I am investigating. I would advise you, however, to raise the matter voluntarily with Miss Clara, once this business is concluded. She will inherit Mr. Graves one way or another. It would be better for both of you if she heard it from you first. He did not wait for an answer. We were back on the village street before Graves had quite recovered the use of his voice. We walked back across the meadow in the thin morning light, our boots dark with dew. Von Holmes was quiet for a while, not the thinking silence of earlier, but the quieter silence of a man who has confirmed the architecture of something and is now turning it in his mind to check the joins. The motive, I said eventually, is established. The motive, Holmes agreed, is as clear as anything I have encountered. Edmund was about to file a will that would remove the estate from Aldous entirely. He had 8 months from the time of that consultation to do so, and he had not done so yet. The reasons for that delay are not our concern. Perhaps he was waiting for a further reconciliation with Clara, perhaps simply for the right occasion. What matters is that when he died, The signed document had not been filed, and it has since, he glanced at me, all not been found. You think Aldous took it? I think Aldous took a great many things from that study, Holmes said. The diary pages, the will, possibly correspondence we have not yet identified, and I think he arranged, by means we have yet to fully establish, for Edmund to die believing himself abandoned by the last person in the world whose love he valued. He paused on the path, looking back at the house, where the tower was visible above the tree line against the cold sky. That is not a simple crime, Watson. That is a patient one, and patient crimes require patient investigation. I followed his gaze to the tower. How long had he been planning it, I asked. Holmes turned back to the path and walked on. Long enough, he said, to have it prepared before Edmund ever signed the new will, which tells us something rather specific about Lord Aldous Pembridge's character, if nothing else. He turned up his collar against a freshening wind coming off the downs. A man who plans ahead is a man who anticipates, and a man who anticipates a death before it has been arranged is a man who has arranged a great many things we have not yet found. The house waited at the end of the meadow, grey and still and large in the November light, with the tower standing over it like an explanation that nobody had yet thought to ask for. I said nothing. There was at that moment nothing adequate to say. Asterisk. Chapter 4. What the stable boy saw. Holmes spent the afternoon of our second day at Ravenscourt in what appeared to any observer who did not know him to be a state of pleasant and purposeless idleness. He walked the grounds. He admired the walled garden, largely dead now in November, with the attentive appreciation of a man who has suddenly developed an interest in horticulture. He paused at the stables and exchanged a few words with the head groom about the comparative merits of 2 horses whose names I did not catch. He wandered along the east wing of the house with his hands in his pockets, looking up at the stonework with the vague, benign expression of a man taking the air. At one point I saw him from an upstairs window crouching near the garden door of the east wing, the servant's access to the private study, examining the iron latch with what appeared to be mild curiosity, before straightening and moving on without apparent conclusion. I had learned, over many years, not to mistake this performance for what it resembled. Holmes in apparent idleness was Holmes at his most purposeful. The casual walk was a survey, the admiration of the garden was reconnaissance, and the conversations with the servants, brief, warm, apparently inconsequential, were the precise and patient laying of groundwork that would, in due course, produce exactly what he was looking for. He found it in the stable yard at 3:30, in the form of a boy of perhaps 15 named Thomas. I happened to be crossing the yard at the time, having come from a walk of my own along the lane that bordered the eastern meadow, and I paused at the gate when I saw Holmes in conversation with the lad, not because I wished to eavesdrop, but because something in the quality of the exchange stopped me. Holmes had set himself on the low wall beside the water trough, with the deliberate informality of a man who has decided that height and authority are obstacles, and Thomas stood before him with the posture of someone simultaneously wanting to speak and afraid to. He was a red-cheeked, broad-shouldered boy with honest eyes, and the permanently anxious expression of a young person carrying a secret that has grown too heavy for the space it was allotted. I didn't approach. I watched from the gate. I could not hear everything. The wind was against me and Holmes spoke quietly, but I caught enough. Holmes was not asking direct questions. He was talking about the estate in general terms, about the horses, about the late Sir Edmund's habits, about nothing in particular, and the boy was answering in monosyllables that gradually lengthened as the tension of the encounter lessened. Then Holmes said something, a single sentence, delivered with the same conversational lightness as everything before it, and Thomas stopped entirely. He looked at the ground. He looked at Holmes. He looked at the ground again, and then he talked. It lasted perhaps 10 minutes. I watched Holmes's face throughout, and I noted the moment, approximately 4 minutes in. when his expression shifted from the patient attentiveness of a man drawing out a reluctant witness to something quieter and more concentrated, the look of a man who has just heard the piece that completes the shape of something he has been assembling in the dark. When it was over, Holmes placed a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder, like said something that made Thomas nod with visible relief and stood. He saw me at the gate and came across the yard with his usual unhurried stride, his breath faintly visible in the cold afternoon air. "Walk with me," he said. We took the path along the east wall of the house, away from the stable yard and the windows of the main rooms. Holmes walked with his eyes forward and his voice low. "Thomas," he said, "has been carrying something on his conscience for 3 weeks, which is rather longer than a boy of his constitution is built to manage. He required very little encouragement once he understood that I was not here to cause him difficulty. What did he see? 14 days before Edmund's death, which places it with considerable precision in the middle of the diary's missing fortnight, Thomas was unable to sleep. He's a light sleeper by his own account, and one of the other lads in the stable dormitory snores. He came out into the yard around midnight for air." Holmes paused. He saw a figure crossing the east courtyard, a man, moving quietly, carrying a leather satchel of the kind used for documents. Thomas described the shape of it quite specifically, and the way it was held close against the body, as a man carries something he does not wish to swing or jostle. And he recognised the figure. He's quite certain. The moon was partial but sufficient, and the figure passed within 20 feet of him. It was Lord Aldous Pembridge. Holmes glanced at me. Moving toward the garden door of the east wing, the door that accesses the private study corridor without passing through the main house. I considered this, and Aldous has said he was never in that wing. He told me yesterday evening, with the easy confidence of a man who does not expect to be contradicted, that he rarely visited the east study, and had certainly not done so in the weeks before Edmund's death. A pause. That statement is now, shall we say, in some difficulty. What was he doing there? Holmes was quiet for a moment, and I recognised the quality of the silence. Not uncertainty, but the careful ordering of a conclusion already reached. "The diary," he said at last, "had entries through the 14th of September. The gap begins on the 15th. Thomas saw Aldous in the east courtyard in the middle of that fortnight, carrying a document satchel." He stopped walking. We had reached the corner of the east wing, and I was aware, without quite having planned to be, that we were standing perhaps 30 feet from the garden door in question. A low iron-banded door set into the stone, half hidden by the remains of a climbing plant that had been cut back for winter. Edmund was a methodical man, a diary keeper for 30 years. He did not tear those pages out himself, Watson. He had no reason to. Whatever he recorded during those 2 weeks, he recorded in good faith, in the ordinary course of a life he did not yet know was ending. But Aldous did know, I said slowly. Aldous had been in that study, Holmes said, and he had removed those pages, and he had done so carrying a document satchel because he had come prepared. That is not the act of a man who has wandered in on impulse. That is the act of a man executing a plan. He turned from the door and began walking back along the path. And there is one further detail Thomas mentioned, which I find perhaps the most significant of all. What detail? The date. He's certain of it because the following morning was his birthday. He turned 15, and he had been awake thinking about it when he came out into the yard. The date was the 23rd of September. Holmes looked at me steadily. Graves told us this morning that Edmund consulted him about the revised will 8 months ago, which places that consultation in March. Aldous would have needed time to learn of the new will, through Mrs. Alderton, through any number of channels available to a man with connections in this household, and then to obtain the duplicate seal, and then to begin the interception of correspondence. A pause. The engraver, if I am right, was visited considerably earlier than September, but the removal of the diary pages, the erasure of whatever Edmund wrote during those particular 2 weeks that required access to the study, physical access, in person at night when the house was asleep. We walked in silence for a moment. What did Edmund write about during those 2 weeks? I said. That Aldous needed to destroy? I cannot tell you with certainty, Holmes said, but I can make a reasonable conjecture. Those were the weeks, I believe, when Edmund was writing to Clara. The real letters, warm, reconciling, the genuine voice of a father, trying to repair what had been broken. Aldous was intercepting the post, substituting forgeries. But if Edmund had been recording in his diary what he was writing, what he was feeling, the precise terms of the letters he was sending, then those diary entries would have constituted direct evidence that the cold letters Clara received were not his. He paused. Aldous could not leave that evidence in place. The comprehension of it settled over me with a particular chill that has nothing to do with November or weather. I had seen Holmes solve crimes of violence and crimes of passion and crimes of elaborate mechanical ingenuity. But there is a category of crime, rarer and in some ways more terrible, that operates entirely in the register of the emotional, that does its work not on the body but on the heart. The image of Edmund Pembridge climbing that tower alone at night, the cold letter in his memory, believing himself despised by his own daughter, was not an image I could set aside easily. He was quite alone when he died, I said. I'd not meant to say it aloud. Yes, said Holmes. He said it without inflection, but there was something in the word, a quality of recognition almost, that told me he had arrived at the same image some time before I had, and had been carrying it with him since. We reached the corner of the main house. Through the drawing-room windows I could see the lamp lit against the early dusk, and in the room's warm light the figure of Clara Pembridge seated at the writing desk, working, or attempting to work, with the determined application of a woman who has decided that motion is preferable to stillness. I asked Thomas to say nothing, Holmes said. He was grateful for the instruction. He's not a boy who wishes to carry secrets. And being relieved of the need to decide whether to speak has visibly lightened him. He looked at the drawing-room window for a moment. He liked Sir Edmund, I think. Most people who were not Aldous Pembridge appear to have liked Sir Edmund. What happens now? Holmes turned from the window. Now, he said, I want to speak to the housekeeper. He said it in the tone of a man who already knows what the housekeeper will say, and is looking forward with a certain cold precision to hearing her say it. Asterisk. Chapter 5. The housekeeper's burden. Mrs. Alderton had been at Ravenscourt for 19 years. I established this from the housekeeper herself, not from Holmes, who had known it already. I could tell from the absence of surprise when she mentioned it. In the way one can tell a man has heard a piece of music before by the stillness with which he receives its opening notes. 19 years was long enough to have known Edmund Pembridge as a younger man, long enough to have watched the estrangement with Clara develop and calcify, long enough to have become, as devoted servants of long tenure invariably do, less an employee of the household than a structural feature of it, as fixed and as load-bearing in her own way as the walls she maintained. Holmes had found her in the linen room off the main corridor, which she appeared to use as a kind of administrative retreat, a small, warm, cedar-scented space where the ordered shelves of pressed cloth and the neat ledgers stacked on the side table gave an impression of a life built on the satisfaction of things being in their correct places, or were, I noted from my position near the door, consistently directed at points slightly to the left of whoever she was addressing. She did not meet Holmes's gaze. She had not met it once since we arrived at Ravenscourt, a fact I had registered without understanding, and which Holmes had clearly registered with considerably more purpose. He sat across from her at the small table in the linen room, with the unhurried ease of a man conducting a conversation about nothing consequential, and he talked, for the first several minutes, about the house, its history, its management, the difficulty of maintaining a property of this size in the modern era. He was, in these preliminaries, both genuinely interested and entirely strategic, drawing her out of the posture of professional reserve into the slightly warmer register of someone speaking about work they are proud of, work that has constituted the meaning of a long portion of their life. I watched the process with the attention I always gave it. Holmes's approach to reluctant witnesses was one of the things I had most consistently failed to adequately describe in my published accounts, because it operated below the threshold of the dramatic. It was not the sudden revelation of a concealed fact or the brilliant deduction announced with a flourish, but something quieter and more patient, a kind of careful clearing of the ground around a thing until the thing itself had nowhere left to hide. When he shifted the conversation to Edmund's final weeks, she did not flinch exactly, but something in her posture changed, a fractional tightening of the hands where they rested on the table, a slight contraction of the breath that I noted with the instinct of a medical man. "You were fond of Sir Edmund," Holmes said. It was not a question. "He was a good man," she said. Her voice was even and careful. "A fair employer. I have had others. And the days after his death were difficult for you. For everyone in the house." "Yes," Holmes paused. "Mrs. Alderton, I am going to ask you something directly, and I want you to understand before I do so that I am not here to judge the decision you made. I believe you acted in good faith, in loyalty to someone you trusted, and without full understanding of what that loyalty was being used to accomplish." He let that sit for a moment. "The morning after Sir Edmund's death, Lord Aldous gave you an envelope." The hands on the table didn't move, but the quality of their stillness changed. "He asked you to burn it," Holmes said. "He told you it was private correspondence belonging to Sir Edmund and that it was no one else's business, and you burned it." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 8 seconds. I have rarely been more aware of the length of 8 seconds. "He said Edmund would have wanted it," she said at last. Her voice had changed, not broken, but altered, carrying now a weight it had not carried before, the weight of something that had been held in an interior room for 3 weeks, and was finally being admitted into the light. "He said it was personal letters that Edmund had kept privately, and that it would cause embarrassment to the family if they were read. He was very certain about it, very calm." "He is generally calm," Holmes said without emphasis. "I had no reason to question him. He is the head of the family now. He was giving me an instruction about his brother's private affairs." A pause. "I have burned correspondence before, on instruction. It is not an unusual thing." "No," said Holmes gently. "It is not. Can you describe the envelope?" She could. And she did, with the precision of a woman whose professional life has trained her to observe and retain the details of material objects. The pale blue of the paper, which she identified without prompting as Edmund's preferred correspondence stock. Oui, unbroken. The red wax pressed with the unbroken. The red wax pressed with the Pembridge crest. She had not opened it. She had placed it in the kitchen grate and watched it burn, and she had not thought about it again until Holmes had arrived at Ravenscourt, and she had understood, by some instinct she could not articulate precisely, that thinking about it was now unavoidable. "The seal was intact," Holmes said. He said it quietly, but I heard the precision of it, the selection of that detail from among everything else she had offered. "Unbroken. Yes. So the envelope had never been opened?" "Not that I could see." "That envelope," Holmes said. "There was a letter that Sir Edmund wrote and that never reached its intended recipient. It was intercepted, taken from the post before it left the house, or before it arrived at its destination. And it was kept, I believe, as insurance, as evidence, as a record of the correspondence that Aldous needed to control. When Edmund died, it became a liability rather than an asset, and so it was burned." He looked at her steadily. "You destroyed evidence of a serious crime, Mrs. Alderton. Not knowingly and not willingly, and I intend to make that as clear as it can be made. But I need you to understand what it was that you burned." She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had the flat, controlled quality of a person sustaining composure by main force. "He told me Edmund would have wanted it. I know he did. I have known Lord Aldous for 19 years. I had no reason—" She stopped, started again. "Is it true? What you're suggesting about Sir Edmund's death?" Holmes considered the question for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. "I believe," he said, "that your employer was manipulated into a despair he did not deserve by a man who understood his vulnerabilities and used them with deliberate precision for the purpose of inheriting a property he had no legal right to. Whether that constitutes murder in the terms the law will recognise is a question I cannot yet answer. But I am satisfied that Edmund Pembridge did not die by accident, and I am satisfied that Lord Aldous Pembridge is responsible for the conditions that led to his death." He paused. "I am sorry to tell you this. I recognise that it's not a small thing after 19 years. Mrs. Alderton looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She looked briefly at the ordered shelves of pressed linen on either side of her. The 19 years of careful work, all the mornings and seasons and details of maintenance that had constituted her life in this house, and something in her face suggested that she was performing, in a compressed and private way, a kind of accounting. "What do you need from me?" she said at last. "A written account," said Holmes, "of the envelope, the instruction, and the burning, in your own words, signed and dated. It will not be comfortable, but it will be necessary." She nodded once with the decisive quality of a woman who has made a decision and intends to keep it. "I will write it this evening," she said. Before I can think of the reasons not to, Holmes stood. "Thank you, Mrs. Alderton." She did not reply. She was looking at the grate in the corner of the linen room, small, iron, cold at this time of day, with an expression I recognised from surgical practice, the expression of someone replaying a moment they cannot change and examining it for the first time without the protection of not quite knowing what it meant. Holmes said nothing until we were back in the corridor, the linen room door closed behind us. Then he walked to the window at the corridor's end and stood looking out at the darkening grounds, and I stood beside him, and for a while neither of us spoke. "She is a loyal woman," I said eventually. "She did not know." "No," said Holmes. "She did not know. That is the particular elegance of what Aldous constructed. Everyone who assisted him did so without understanding that they were assisting him. Thomas saw something and told no one, out of a boy's uncertainty about what he ought to do. Graves enabled the situation by his own dishonesty. Mrs. Alderton destroyed evidence in the genuine belief she was honouring a dead man's privacy. He built his crime out of other people's ordinary human failings, Watson. That is considerably more difficult to dismantle than a crime built on direct action." Outside, the early dark of November was settling over the grounds. The tower was visible at the east end of the house, its upper edge faintly defined against a sky that had turned the colour of cold iron. "The burned envelope," I said. "What was in it?" "A letter from Edmund to Clara," Holmes said. "One of the real ones. Warm, reconciling. The genuine correspondence that Aldous was intercepting and replacing with forgeries. He had kept it. Why he kept it rather than destroying it immediately is a question of psychology rather than method. Perhaps as evidence against Clara if she later contested the will, perhaps simply from the collector's instinct that afflicts certain kinds of careful criminals." A pause. "When Edmund died and the will question became moot, or appeared to, the letter became only a risk, and so it was burned by a woman who thought she was performing an act of discretion." I thought of the pale blue envelope in the kitchen grate, Edmund's correspondence stock, Edmund's seal unbroken, a letter that had never arrived. "He never knew," I said. "Edmund. Whether Clara received his letters?" "He died not knowing," Holmes said quietly. "That is, I think, the most precise way to describe what Aldous took from him." The tower stood in the November dark. Holmes turned from the window. "Tomorrow," he said, "I am going to London." Asterisk. Chapter 6. An ink that does not lie Holmes left for London on the first morning train. He did not explain his purpose in detail. He rarely did at this stage of an investigation, preferring to return with conclusions rather than advertise intentions that might yet be frustrated, and I had learned not to press him. What he did say, before departing with his coat and his travelling bag, and the leather document case in which he had placed the 2 letters for closer examination was this. Keep your eyes on Aldous, Watson, not obtrusively. Ye simply observe. A man who knows his position is secure behaves differently from a man who suspects it may not be. I want to know which kind of man he is. Aldous, for his part, was the fire that did not know it was being watched. He moved through the house and the day with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his circumstances, taking breakfast at leisure, spending the morning hours in correspondence in Edmund's former study, receiving the local land agent in the afternoon with the assured cordiality of a new proprietor, beginning to understand the dimensions of what he has acquired. He asked after Holmes once, with a mildness that I found, knowing what I knew, faintly extraordinary. I told him Holmes had been called briefly to London on a related matter. Aldous nodded thoughtfully and said that he hoped the journey would give Miss Clara some resolution. He said it with every appearance of meaning it. Clara spent the day in her father's library. When I looked in on her in the late afternoon, she was sitting with a book open and unread in her lap, looking at the window and the pale winter light beyond it in the way that people look at things when they are not seeing them. I did not disturb her. There are forms of grief that require silence more than company, and I had some experience in identifying them. Holmes returned on the last train, arriving at Ravenscourt shortly before 10 in the evening, with the expression of a man who has found what he went looking for and is exercising considerable discipline in not saying so immediately. He accepted a late supper, then declined to discuss London until the house was quiet, and it was not until well past 11, when the last lamp had gone out beneath Aldous's door, and the corridor had settled into the particular stillness of an old house at night, that he spread the contents of his document case on the writing table in our shared sitting room and began to talk. He had brought, in addition to the 2 letters, a small leather roll of the kind used by watchmakers and jewellers to carry tools, and several sheets of his own notes covered in the small, dense handwriting that I had spent years learning to read. He opened the leather roll first and extracted a magnifying lens, finer than his usual pocket lens, the kind used for close manuscript work, and placed it on the table beside the letters. "Sit down, Watson," he said. I am going to show you something that any reasonably well-trained eye can see, once it knows where to look. I want you to see it yourself rather than simply take my word for it, because you will be asked, in due course, to confirm it. I sat. He placed the 2 letters side by side on the table, weighted at their corners with books to hold them flat, and angled the lamp so that its light fell across them at a low raking angle. "Look at the ink," he said. "Not the handwriting, the ink itself, the colour, the surface quality, the way the light catches it." I looked. I am not, I admit, a man of scientific temperament in the precise sense Holmes employs the word, but I have eyes, and I used them. The ink of the warm letter, the one found on Edmund's desk, the one I now believe to be genuine, had a quality that I would have described, left to my own vocabulary, as slightly warm, brown-black, with a faint lustre where the lamp caught its surface. The ink of the cold letter, the forgery, the one that had driven Edmund to despair, was darker, blacker in the pure sense, with a different quality of surface, less warm and more flat, absorbing the lamplight rather than reflecting it. "They are different," I said. "They are entirely different inks," Holmes said. "The warm letter uses carbon ink, lamp black suspended in a gum medium. It is the older formulation, still used by men of Edmund's generation who were trained on it and never saw reason to change. It is warm in colour, slightly brown at the edges of a dried stroke, and it has that faint surface sheen you can see under raking light." He indicated the second letter. "The cold letter uses iron gall ink, the modern formulation, acidic, blacker, duller in surface, with a slight bite to the paper fibres that carbon ink does not produce. 2 entirely different substances, Watson, used by, apparently, the same hand in the same period for letters addressed to the same person." "Edmund would not have switched inks between letters," I said. "Edmund had used carbon ink exclusively for at least 15 years. I confirmed it this morning." He paused. I went first to Edmund's club in Pall Mall, where he kept a writing room. The secretary, who remembered him well, confirmed that Edmund supplied his own ink, and had done so for as long as he could recall. Always the same preparation, purchased from the same stationer in Jermyn Street. I visited the stationer. They confirmed his standing order, carbon ink. Quarterly, last filled 7 months ago. Edmund Pembridge did not own iron gall ink and had not purchased any in 15 years. The simplicity of it was, as Holmes's best evidence always was, almost startling. Not a complex technical deduction, but a plain material fact, available to anyone who knew where to look and what question to ask. The forger had used the wrong ink. Not out of ignorance necessarily. Iron gall was perfectly plausible for a Victorian gentleman, but out of the ordinary assumption that ink is ink, that no one would think to ask about it, that the handwriting was the thing that would be scrutinised, and the medium it was written in would be invisible. He made one error, I said. He made several, Holmes said, but this one is demonstrable without argument. A chemical analysis would confirm it definitively. And I have taken samples to a colleague at the Royal Institution, who will provide a written report within the week. He set the lens down. But I want to show you the second element, which does not require chemistry. He placed the lens in my hand and directed my attention to the wax seals, both letters set now with the seal fragments visible, the broken red wax still adhering to the folded edges of each document. "Look at the authentic seal first," he said. "The warm letter." I looked. Through the lens, the wax impression was clear. The Pembridge crest, a device involving a bird of some kind above a chevron, rendered in the slight relief of a hand press. And I saw what Holmes had noted 2 evenings ago in the drawing-room. The impression was not perfectly centred. The bird sat fractionally to the left of where it should have been, and along the right edge of the seal there was a slight thinning of the impression where the press had not quite contacted the wax with equal pressure. The characteristic mark, as Clara had described, of a worn heirloom device, a tool long used and slightly imperfect for it. "Now the forgery," Holmes said. I moved the lens. The cold letters seal was immediately obviously different in character, not in the design, which was identical, but in the quality of the impression. It was perfectly centred. The pressure was exactly even across the entire surface. The bird sat precisely where it should sit. The chevron was precisely rendered, and there was no thinning at any edge. It was the impression of a device in perfect mechanical condition, newly made, with no history of use worn into it. "A duplicate," I said. "Cast from a plaster mould taken of the original," Holmes said. "It is a specialist technique, not widely known but entirely possible for a skilled craftsman. The duplicate would produce an impression virtually indistinguishable from the original to an untrained eye, but to anyone who has examined both, side by side under magnification, the difference is absolute." He took the lens back and set it on the table. Edmund's seal was asymmetric because it was old and imperfect. Any duplicate cast from a plaster mould of the face only, without reproducing the wear and the slight distortion of the original, would be perfectly symmetric. The forgery advertises itself, Watson, to anyone who looks carefully enough. The difficulty is that no one had reason to look carefully enough until now. I sat back and looked at the 2 letters lying side by side on the writing table. The warm and the cold, the genuine and the fabricated, the letter of a loving father and the instrument of a calculated destruction. In the lamp's low light, the difference in the inks was visible now that I knew to see it, and the sealed edges told their own story in red wax and asymmetry. 2 independent lines of proof, I said, the ink and the seal. "Each sufficient on its own," Holmes said. "Together, incontrovertible." He began to roll the letters carefully for return to the document case. But incontrovertible is not the same as complete. I know the forgery is a forgery. I know Aldous commissioned a duplicate seal. What I do not yet have is the duplicate seal itself. And without it, without the physical object in Aldous's possession, a sufficiently determined barrister might construct an alternative. Then we need the seal. We need the engraver, Holmes said. A craftsman who performed specialist work for a specific client, for a specific purpose, at a specific time. That man exists, Watson. I spent 3 hours this afternoon establishing that he exists and approximately where to find him. He closed the document case with the quiet finality of a man who has done what he set out to do and is already thinking about what comes next. Tomorrow I go back to London, to a particular street in Clerkenwell. He extinguished the lamp. In the darkness the house was entirely still. The old stones, the November cold beyond the windows, and somewhere at the east end of the building the tower standing against a sky too overcast for stars. I sat for a moment before rising, thinking about ink, about the difference between carbon and iron gall, between warm and cold, between a genuine hand and a careful imitation of it, about how much damage can be accomplished with nothing more than a pen, a forged seal, and the willingness to use them. Holmes, I said. Yes. He will have destroyed the seal by now, surely. A pause in the darkness. Perhaps, Holmes said, or perhaps he kept it. Men who plan carefully have a tendency to keep their instruments, Watson. They are accustomed to things being useful. It is one of the more reliable vanities of the methodical criminal. Another pause. Another. We will know tomorrow. Asterisk. Chapter 7. A journey to Clerkenwell. Holmes was gone before I came down to breakfast. He had left a note, 3 lines in his compressed hand, propped against the coffee pot. London again, back by evening. Say nothing to Aldous about yesterday's work. If he asks, tell him I'm pursuing a line of inquiry that may prove irrelevant. S.H. I read it twice, pocketed it, and spent the morning doing what Holmes had asked, which was, in essence, nothing, performed with as much naturalness as I could manage. Aldous appeared at breakfast with the same polished ease he had brought to every encounter since our arrival, and I sat across from him and discussed the weather, the condition of the South Meadow fencing, and the particular difficulty of heating a house of Ravenscourt's dimensions in November. And I watched him throughout with the attention of a man who has been given a specific task and intends to carry it out properly. What I observed confirmed Holmes's assessment from 2 days prior. Aldous was not a nervous man. He did not have the quality of suppressed anxiety that I had seen in Graves, the over-deliberate calm of someone maintaining a posture against internal pressure. His ease was not a performance, or rather, and this was the thought that stayed with me through the morning. If it was a performance, it had been performed so long and so consistently that the distinction between the act and the actor had ceased to be meaningful. He had convinced himself, I thought. A man who plans a thing with sufficient care and executes it with sufficient patience can arrive, eventually, at a place where he no longer experiences it as what it was. The machinery of justification is, in certain constitutions, very efficient. Holmes returned at 7:30 in the evening on the last train from London, and I met him at the door before Mrs. Alderton could, wanting to read his face before Aldous had the opportunity to observe it. What I saw there satisfied me entirely. He was tired. 2 days of trains and London footwork in November had put a certain quality of grey into his complexion, but his eyes were entirely alive, and he was carrying, in addition to his travelling bag, a small wrapped parcel that he transferred immediately to his coat pocket with the care of a man conveying something fragile. "The study," he said quietly, "when the house is quiet." It was an hour before the house was quiet enough. We sat at the writing table as we had the night before, the lamp between us, and Holmes placed the wrapped parcel on the table and did not immediately open it. "Tell me first what you observed today," he said. I told him. He listened without interruption, and when I described Aldous at breakfast, the absence of nervous affect, the quality of ease that had calcified into genuine comfort, Holmes nodded once with the expression of a man having a hypothesis confirmed. "Yes," he said. "He believes it is over. The will has not been filed. The inquest is closed. Clara is distressed but has no evidence, and the solicitor's irregularities give him a card to play if Graves becomes inconvenient. From where Aldous stands, the remaining variable was myself. and I have been going to London on what he has been told is a possibly irrelevant line of inquiry. A faint pause. He is wrong on every count, but his confidence is not unreasonable, given what he knows. And what happened in Clerkenwell? Holmes looked at the parcel. He unwrapped it with deliberate care, several layers of protective cloth, and set its contents on the table between us. It was a wax seal press, small, perhaps 4 inches in height, with a turned wooden handle worn smooth with use and a brass device at its base, the Pembridge crest, bird above chevron, rendered with the clean precision of a craftsman's new work. I looked at it under the lamp and saw immediately, without needing the lens, what distinguished it from the heirloom press, upstairs in Edmund's study. It was perfect. The device was perfectly centred, the edges perfectly defined, without the slightest asymmetry or wear. It was a copy in the way that a forgery is a copy, indistinguishable at a glance, absolute in its difference to a trained eye. The engraver, Holmes said, is a man named Culver. He works from a workshop in a court off St. John Street. Small operation, high quality, the kind of craftsman who takes work that the larger London engravers consider beneath them, or too particular. Specialist seal duplications, monogram replacements, the restoration of damaged heraldic devices. He is good at what he does, and he knows his clientele well enough to ask no unnecessary questions. But he remembered Aldous. He remembered the commission with considerable clarity, 6 months ago, the 28th of April, which Culver confirmed from his order book. A gentleman came to the workshop with a plaster-cast mould of a seal device, and commissioned a duplicate press. The plaster cast was of professional quality, made by someone who understood the process, using a 2-part mould to capture the full relief of the device. Culver performed the work over the following week, produced the press you see here, and was paid in cash. The commissioner gave the name Harrington. A false name. Culver was not deceived about its falseness. He is, as I said, a man who does not ask unnecessary questions. But he retained the order in his book. He retained an impression taken from the completed press as a record of his work. Standard practice. And he retained, most significantly, a physical description of the commissioner. Holmes looked at me. I brought a photograph. He produced it from his coat, a cabinet card, one of several taken for some county occasion judging by the formal setting, showing Aldous Pembridge in 3/4 profile with the composed, distinguished expression he wore for the world. Culver identified him immediately, Holmes said, without hesitation, without prompting, beyond being shown the photograph alongside 3 others. He pointed to Aldous and said, "That is Mr. Harrington." A pause. "He will travel to Sussex and repeat that identification in whatever context is required. I have his written statement to that effect, signed, and the workshop impression as corroborating documentation." I looked at the seal press on the table, at the Pembridge crest, perfect and new, made to deceive a dead man's daughter. The thought of the planning involved, the trip to London 6 months ago, the plaster mould prepared in advance, the false name given to a craftsman who had the intelligence and the discretion not to press it, produced in me the particular revulsion that methodical cruelty always produces more reliably than passionate violence. Passion, at least, is human. This was something colder. "The seal was not destroyed," I said. "The seal was not destroyed," Holmes confirmed. "I found it, as I half expected to, in Aldous' London townhouse. Or rather, I engaged a contact of mine, a man who has on previous occasions performed certain inquiries of a discreet investigative nature that are beyond my own reach, without legal authorization. The seal was in a locked drawer in the desk of Aldous' private study. My contact confirmed its presence and its description, and I have his statement. The seal itself remains where it is. I had no legal basis to remove it, but its location is documented, and when the inspector arrives with appropriate authority, it will be recovered." "Holmes," I said, "you have it all?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the seal press from Culver's workshop, the copy, the instrument of the forgery, and then at the wall beyond it, as a man looks at nothing in particular when he is reviewing something in his mind. "I have the mechanism," he said. "The duplicate seal and the engraver who made it. The ink analysis from the Royal Institution, which will be delivered by post within 3 days. Mrs. Alderton's written account, Thomas's testimony, Clara's alibi for the Edinburgh postmark, so which I have not yet formally confirmed, but which is the next piece." He paused. "Each element is strong. Together they are, as I said last night, incontrovertible." "Then why," I said slowly, reading his expression, "do you not look satisfied?" He was quiet for a moment longer than the question required. "Because I'm going to bring this before a man who will stand in Edmund's study and listen to every piece of evidence I have assembled," he said, "and I am going to watch him understand that there is no longer a version of events that protects him, and I want to be certain, entirely certain, that I am right." He looked at me. "Not for the court, Watson, for Edmund." He picked up the seal press, wrapped it again with the same care, and placed it in the document case with the 2 letters and Culver's statement and Mrs. E.R. Alderton's account. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "First I want Clara's testimony confirmed. Then we will have everything we need, and I will send for the inspector, and we will finish it." He closed the document case and latched it, and the small, definitive sound of it in the quiet room had the quality of a door being closed on something. Outside, the tower stood in the dark as it always stood, but for the first time since our arrival at Ravenscourt, it seemed to me less a monument to what had been done than to what was about to be answered for. Asterisk. Chapter 8. Clara's Testimony. The following morning, Holmes rose early and asked Clara if she would speak with him alone. He did not frame it as an interview. He asked it in the way one asks a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time whether they would like to set it down, with the particular gentleness of a man who understands that the person he is addressing has not, until this moment, been given adequate opportunity to be heard. Clara agreed immediately, and they sat together in the small morning room at the back of the house, a room I gathered Edmund had used for informal correspondence, warmer and less formal than the study, with windows overlooking the kitchen garden and the grey winter light coming in flat and even from the east. I was not present. Holmes had not asked me to be, and I had not offered. There are conversations that require only 2 people, and I had sufficient respect for Clara's situation, and for Holmes's management of it, to occupy myself elsewhere for the hour it lasted. I walked the grounds instead, following the path along the south meadow that I had taken several times during our stay, and had come to associate with the particular mental state of a man who knows more than he can yet act on. The morning was cold and still, the grass white at the edges with a frost that had not quite lifted, and the house was visible behind me the entire length of the path, the main block, the east wing, and the tower rising above both with its habitual indifferent authority. I thought about Edmund Pembridge, as I had found myself doing with increasing frequency over the past 4 days. Not the abstract Edmund of the case, the victim, the testator, and the man whose correspondence had been intercepted, but the specific one, assembled gradually from the details that testimony and observation had provided. A man of 60 who kept a diary for 30 years, who used the same carbon ink from the same Jermyn Street stationer for 15 years, who had a seal press inherited from his father, and never thought to have its worn edge repaired because the asymmetry of it was, by then, simply itself, the mark of a thing long used and loved. A man who had quarrelled with his daughter and spent years regretting it, and had then attempted with careful and genuine effort to repair what had broken. Who had written warm letters and received cold ones in return, and had believed the cold ones because why would he not? Because the seal was his seal and the hand was his daughter's hand, and the world does not generally prepare a man for the particular cruelty that had been devised for him. I turned at the end of the path and walked back toward the house, and I did not look at the tower. Holmes and Clara were still in the morning room when I returned. Through the half-open door I could hear not the words but the quality of the conversation. Holmes's voice low and steady, Clara's occasionally catching on something and then recovering. The sound of a woman telling a painful story to someone she trusts to receive it correctly. I went to the library and waited. They came out after another 20 minutes. Clara's eyes were red, but her posture was straight. And she had the look of someone who has wept for the right reason rather than the wrong one. Not from despair, but from the relief of having been understood. Holmes touched her arm briefly and said something I did not hear, and she nodded, and then she went upstairs and Holmes came into the library and sat down across from me. "Well," I said. "Everything the outline required," he said. He was tired. The accumulated fatigue of 3 days' intensive work was showing now at the edges of him, in the set of his shoulders and the slight flatness of his voice. But his eyes were clear, and the expression on his face was the one I'd come to recognise as his form of satisfaction. Not pleasure exactly, but the particular quality of resolution that comes when the last piece of a structure settles into its position and the whole becomes stable. "The correspondence," he said, "as she experienced it, was precisely as I had reconstructed it. Years of warm, regular letters from her father, monthly, sometimes more frequently. Then, 8 months ago, a shift. The letters became formal, then cool, then the final one, the letter she received in Bath 6 weeks before Edmund's death, which was cold in a way she found not merely hurtful but bewildering. Not because estrangement was impossible between them, they had managed it before, but because the voice was wrong." He paused. "That was the word she used. Wrong. Not wrong in content, but wrong in voice. The rhythms were not her father's rhythms. The particular way he constructed an argument, the specific habits of a man she had been reading for 30 years, they were absent. She had told herself she was imagining it. That grief and guilt were colouring her reading, that she was inventing absences because she wanted to believe he had not truly meant what the letter said. She was not imagining it. She was not. The cold letter was written by someone who had studied Edmund's hand with considerable skill and had reproduced the letter forms accurately, but who could not reproduce the mind behind the hand, the specific cadences of thought, the private idiom of a man's written voice that his daughter, having read him all her life, would register as absent even without being able to name what was missing. Holmes looked at the window. Forgery is, in the end, a surface operation. It can copy the appearance of a thing. It cannot copy the thing itself. "And her location," I said. "Bath. Bath. Continuously. For 3 months prior to Edmund's death, and for a month before that as well. She's been staying under the name Hartley, her mother's maiden name, at a lodging house in the Lansdowne area, having left London after the failure of a marriage she has disclosed to no one in her family and which she had no wish to explain. She has witnesses, the landlady, a physician she consulted twice during her stay, a woman of her acquaintance who visited her in October." He paused. "She has never been to Edinburgh in her life." The Edinburgh postmark on the cold letter, the letter supposedly written by Clara to Edmund, coldly rejecting his final attempt at reconciliation, postmarked from a city she had not visited. One more element of the forgery confirmed, or one more point at which the architecture of Aldous' construction had been built on the assumption that no one would look carefully enough to see the joins. "He sent the letter himself," I said. "Or had it sent. From Edinburgh." "He had it sent. Possibly through a contact. Possibly through a trusted courier engaged for the purpose with no explanation given. It required only a sealed envelope delivered to someone in Edinburgh with instructions to post it." Holmes considered. It was the element of the plan most dependent on external cooperation. Everything else he could accomplish alone, in his own study, with his duplicate seal and his iron gall ink and his patient practised hand. I thought about the calculation involved, not only in the choice of Edinburgh, but in the entire architecture of the thing. The seal commissioned 6 months before the death. The correspondence intercepted and replaced over a period of months. The diary pages removed. The will's location anticipated and addressed. The burned envelope. Each element considered, planned, executed, and then left in place while Aldous continued to move through the house with his polished ease. "Holmes," I said, "She told you about the marriage?" "She did." That was not a small thing to tell a near stranger. He was quiet for a moment. "She told me," he said, "because I asked her to tell me anything she had been keeping private, on the grounds that a secret kept for reasons of personal dignity can sometimes be the thing a case turns on, and she had the intelligence to understand the distinction between what she wished to conceal and what needed to be known." A pause. "She is a composed and perceptive woman who's been dealt a considerable sequence of blows in a short period of time. She deserved to have someone speak to her as though that were true." I said nothing. There was, occasionally, in Holmes's precise and unsentimental approach to the people in his cases, a quality of recognition that he never named and rarely displayed overtly, but which produced, when it appeared, this particular effect. He sentenced spoken with complete simplicity that carried more weight than a page of eloquence would have done. "The report from the Royal Institution arrives tomorrow," Holmes said, returning to the practical with the ease of a man who has allowed himself a moment outside his usual register and is now stepping back into it. "When it does, I will send for Inspector Calloway from the County Constabulary. Arrives, we will have every element in arrives, we will have every element in place." He moved toward the door and then stopped. "She asked me," he said, without turning, "whether her father had known, at the end, whether there was any chance that he had understood what was being done to him." I waited. "I told her that I did not believe he had known, that he had died believing the cold letter was genuine, and that his daughter did not want him, and that while that was a terrible thing, it was not the same as dying in knowledge of a betrayal he could not prove and could not escape." He paused. "I am not certain it was the right answer. It may have been the kind answer. I find, occasionally, that the two are not perfectly coextensive." He went out, and I sat alone in the library with the winter light coming in flat through the kitchen garden windows, and I thought about a man who had kept a diary for 30 years and never imagined that the last 2 weeks of it would be taken from him, and I found that I had nothing useful to add to what Holmes had said, and so I said nothing to no one in the quiet of the room. Asterisk. Chapter 9. The Confrontation at Ravenscourt. The report from the Royal Institution arrived on the Morning Post. Holmes read it at the breakfast table with the focused brevity of a man consulting a document whose conclusions he already knows and needs only to verify are stated in terms useful for other purposes. He folded it, and we placed it in the document case with the accumulated evidence of the past 4 days, and looked across at me with an expression I had seen before, the particular clarity of a man who has reached the end of a preparation and is now simply ready. "This evening," he said, "I sent word to Inspector Calloway last night. He will arrive at 4. Aldous spent the morning in the estate office with the land agent, discussing drainage arrangements for the south field, maps on the table, both men leaning over them with the focused absorption of people engaged in genuinely practical matters. He looked up once and nodded at me pleasantly. Inspector Calloway arrived at 5 minutes past 4, a square, a deliberate man in his middle 50s with the unhurried competence of a county policeman who has learned over a long career that the most important thing a man can do upon entering a room is establish, quietly and without theatre, that he is not going to leave it without what he came for. He shook Holmes's hand with the grip of a man who had read Holmes's correspondence and taken it seriously. Holmes had arranged the room. Edmund's study had been chosen for the reason Holmes had cited in his notes. The same room from which the forgeries had been launched. The room whose garden door Aldous had entered at midnight with a leather satchel. The room where the diary with its missing fortnight still sat on the shelf. The document case was open on the writing table. The 2 letters lay side by side, weighted at their corners. The wax seal press from Culver's workshop sat at the near edge of the table, where it would be visible from every position in the room. Holmes stood at the fireplace. Calloway stood near the door. I took the chair beside the window. Clara was brought in first by Mrs. Alderton, who had dressed with particular care and held herself with the rigid composure of a woman who has made a decision about her conduct and intends to honour it regardless of what the next hour produces. Clara sat in the chair beside the writing table and looked at the 2 letters lying before her with an expression I could not entirely read. Recognition and grief, and something harder underneath. The compressed anger of a person who has understood fully and finally the dimensions of what was done to her. Aldous was the last to enter. He came in with the same polished ease he had brought to every encounter since our arrival, assessed the assembled company with a single sweep of his grey eyes, noted the inspector with a fractional adjustment of expression that was not alarm but the controlled recalibration of a man who understands that the situation has changed without yet knowing how much, and took the chair that Holmes indicated. He sat with his hands resting on his knees and his back straight, and his face carefully, professionally, neutral. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "this appears to be a more formal occasion than I had anticipated." "It is," said Holmes. "I will be direct with you, Lord Aldous, because the only thing directness costs in situations of this kind is time, and I have no time to waste on increments." He looked at Aldous with the level, unhurried attention of a man who has been waiting several days for this particular moment and intends to use it correctly. "I am going to explain what was done to your brother, and how, and why. I am going to do so with reference to specific evidence, each piece of which is documented and witnessed and will withstand examination. When I am finished, Inspector Calloway will ask you some questions. I would advise you to listen carefully to everything before you speak." Aldous said nothing. His hands rested on his knees. His face was neutral. Holmes began with the will, not because it was the first act of the crime, but because it was the motive, the foundation on which everything else had been built, and a structure is most clearly understood when you start with the thing that made it necessary. Yeah, he laid out the timeline with the precision of a man reading from a document he has memorised. Edmund's consultation with Graves 8 months ago, the new will drawn up in Clara's favour, the signed copy taken away and never filed, its subsequent disappearance from the estate. Then Holmes moved to the correspondence. He placed his hand on the cold letter and explained, in the clear, sequential language he used when precision mattered more than elegance, the ink inconsistency. Carbon versus iron gall. Edmund's 15-year habit, documented at his club, at the Jermyn Street stationer, in the physical evidence of every piece of confirmed correspondence in the house. The cold letter written in iron gall, a substance Edmund had not purchased or used in 15 years, the Royal Institution's chemical analysis, which he produced from the document case and set beside the letter, confirming the distinction in terms that admitted no equivocation. He watched Aldous' face throughout. The first movement was small, a fractional tightening around the eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. The hands on the knees remained still, the expression remained neutral. But something had shifted, and Holmes had seen it, and I had seen Holmes see it. He moved to the seal. He placed the wax seal press from Culver's workshop on the table and explained its provenance in full. The workshop in Clerkenwell, the craftsman named Culver, the commission placed 6 months ago under the name Harrington, the photograph identification. He placed the workshop impression beside the authentic seal fragment and invited everyone in the room to observe the difference. The asymmetry of the genuine press, the perfection of the copy. Then came the testimony, Thomas, Mrs. Alderton, Clara's Edinburgh alibi. Each piece assembled with the methodical certainty of a man laying stones. When Holmes finished, he did not announce it. He simply stopped and looked at Aldous and waited. The silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds. "The engraver," Aldous said at last, "is mistaken in his identification." "He is not," said Holmes. "He identified you from a photograph placed among 3 others, without prompting, without hesitation, and he has provided a signed statement to that effect, which he is prepared to repeat under oath." Aldous was quiet for a moment. Then he tried a different angle, one I had not anticipated, and which suggested that even now in this room, some part of him was still calculating. "Mister, "Holmes," he said, with the measured calm of a man who has decided to bet on his last card, "you have established that a forgery was committed. You have not established by whom. Edmund had enemies, business associates, a former land agent he dismissed under acrimonious circumstances 6 years ago. Any of them might have had both the motive to intercept his correspondence and the means to commission a duplicate seal. You present this evidence as though it admits only one interpretation. It does not." There was a silence. It was, I noted with reluctant admiration, not a foolish argument. It was, in fact, the argument I might have constructed in his position, the only argument left that had any structural coherence. And for a moment I watched Holmes's face, looking for doubt. There was none. "You're correct," Holmes said, "that the evidence of forgery taken in isolation does not identify its author. However, you have overlooked several elements that, taken together, do rather narrow the field. The plaster mould used to commission the duplicate seal required access to the original press, a press kept in your brother's private study. The midnight visit Thomas witnessed, on the 23rd of September, established that you were in that study with a document satchel during the fortnight whose diary pages were subsequently removed. The burned envelope, which Mrs. Alderton has documented in her signed account, was handed to her by you on the morning after Edmund's death, in circumstances that suggest you knew precisely what it contained, and the signed copy of your brother's revised will, the will that would have given Ravenscourt entirely to Clara, has since been located, folded inside a legal folio in the desk of your London townhouse." Holmes paused. "These are not the coincidences of a former land agent. They are the components of a single, sustained, and deliberate plan, and you are the only person in this case who had access to every one of them." Aldous' last card had been played, and had been met, and the room understood this before he did. I watched him absorb it, not with shock exactly, but with the particular quality of a man who has run out of ground and feels the absence of it. Each gambit had been placed and returned to him intact, unshaken, immovable. Aldous tried them one by one, not with panic, which would have been easier to watch, but with the controlled, diminishing persistence of a man working through a prepared list and finding each one return to him unchanged. He did not confess. He did not need to. He sat back in the chair with a small, precise movement, and the quality of his stillness changed, from the controlled stillness of a man managing a performance to the different stillness of a man in whom the performance has simply stopped. He looked at the wall. He looked at nothing. He sat down into himself in the way that a structure settles when the load-bearing element finally gives. Inspector Calloway moved forward from the door. "Lord Aldous Pembridge," he said, in the deliberate, unhurried voice of a man who has waited his whole career for a room this quiet, "I have some questions I would like to ask you, and I would advise you to have the benefit of a solicitor before you answer any of them." Holmes turned from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the grounds, and his back was to the room, and I could not see his face, and I did not try to. Clara did not speak. She looked at the man who had stolen her father's last months, and who had built her grief out of careful forgeries, an intercepted post, and the ordinary human need to believe the handwriting of someone you love. She looked at him with an expression that was not fury. Fury would have been easier for him, but something quieter and more final. The look of a person who has understood something completely and will not ununderstand it. Then she looked away, and that was the end of it. Asterisk. Chapter 10. The Weight of a Letter. The law, as Holmes had predicted, has struggled to name what Aldous Pembridge had done. Inspector Calloway was thorough, and the county prosecutor was diligent, and the case that assembled itself in the weeks following our departure from Ravenscourt was, by any evidential standard, formidable. The Royal Institution's chemical analysis, Culver's identification and signed statement, Mrs. Alderton's account, Thomas's testimony, the duplicate seal recovered from the locked drawer of Aldous' London townhouse. Each element was exactly what Holmes had said it was, and together they constituted a record of premeditated fraud and forgery that the court examined with the grave attention it deserved. The charges, when they were finally drawn, were fraud, forgery, and the criminal suppression of a legal document, specifically the signed copy of Edmund's revised will, Sesqui, which was found folded inside a legal folio in Aldous' London townhouse, placed between two unrelated documents with the apparent intention of being neither discovered nor destroyed. The will was intact. Edmund's signature was clear. The witness signatures were present and subsequently confirmed. The question of Edmund's death, the tower, the night, the fall, was the one the law found most difficult. Holmes spent 3 days in London in the second week of December, in conference with a King's Counsel of his acquaintance, and 2 legal scholars whose particular interest was the intersection of criminal intent and consequence in cases where the mechanism of death was not direct physical violence. The argument he assisted in constructing was novel, not in its principles, but in their application to a case in which a man had been driven to his death not by a hand at his back, but by the deliberate and systematic destruction of his will to remain. It required the court to accept that the space between a forged letter and a man's death was not empty but occupied by grief, by despair, by the reasonable response of a loving father to what he believed was his daughter's final rejection. The court accepted it partially. Aldous Pembridge was convicted on all counts of fraud and forgery, sentenced to 7 years' imprisonment, and the question of criminal culpability in Edmund's death was included in the indictment under a construction that Holmes described as legally imperfect but morally exact. It would not survive a higher appeal, he thought, but it would stand at the level it reached, and it would be on the record. Holmes seemed, when he told me this, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. He had the expression of a man who has built something to the highest standard the available materials permitted, and has made his peace with the fact that the materials had limits. Clara inherited Ravenscourt. The recovered will was sufficient for the probate court, which ruled in the 3rd week of December that the document represented Edmund Pembridge's clear and final testamentary intention, and that its suppression constituted no legal impediment to its execution. The estate, the properties, the £40,000, and the tower that had stood on that particular piece of Sussex ground for 500 years passed to Edmund's daughter on a grey Thursday morning just before Christmas. I thought about what it was to receive the confirmation that a dead man had loved you, and that the evidence of that love had been systematically taken from you, and that you were now in possession of everything he had meant you to have, and that he was not there to see it. There are forms of justice that arrive too late to be entirely distinguishable from loss, and this seemed to me to be one of them. 3 days after she took formal possession of the estate, Clara climbed the tower. I know this because she told me herself, in a letter she sent to Baker Street in the new year, written, I noticed, on her father's pale blue correspondence stock, in a hand that was her own, and entirely her own. She had gone up alone, in the late afternoon, when the light was failing and the grounds were quiet beneath the early January frost. She had not gone to see where he had fallen. She had gone, she said, because she wished to stand where he had stood and look out at the same view. The weald, the downs, the last of the winter light on the fields he had loved, and understand, as clearly as the height and the cold air could make it, that what he had felt in his final months was not the truth of her and him, but a lie imposed on them both by a man who had needed their estrangement more than either of them had. She wrote that she had stood there for perhaps a quarter of an hour, and that she had been cold, and that it was nothing like what she'd feared it would be. Then she had come down and gone into her father's library and sat in his chair and read. I set the letter on the table and looked at it for a while. Then I took it to Holmes, who was at the mantelpiece with his pipe and the morning paper, and I held it out without explanation. He read it once. He folded it, returned it to me, and looked out of the Baker Street window at the January street below for a moment. "She's going to be all right," he said. It was not a prediction. It was the quiet, considered verdict of a man who has taken in all the available evidence and reached a conclusion he trusts. I agreed. I believed it entirely. Holmes said very little about the case in the period following its resolution. He had a habit, after the conclusion of a matter that had engaged him fully, of a particular kind of withdrawal. Not the restless idleness of a man without occupation, but something quieter. The period of internal settlement that follows sustained effort. He played the violin a great deal in December, and he read. He conducted 2 chemical experiments whose purposes he did not explain. Once, in the 2nd week of December, I came into the sitting room and found him standing at the mantelpiece holding Clara's first letter. Not reading it, simply holding it. He set it down when I entered, without self-consciousness. I did not ask what he had been thinking. I did not need to. We had returned to Baker Street by the afternoon train on the last day of November, the case concluded, and Calloway in possession of everything required for the formal proceedings that would follow. I remember the journey, as I remember many journeys taken in the aftermath of Holmes's cases. The particular quality of a train moving through countryside in the late afternoon, the light failing over the downs, the compartment warm against the cold outside the windows. Sir Holmes had the corner seat opposite, eyes half closed, in the posture of a man who has decided to be unavailable to the world for the duration of the journey. The Sussex landscape moved past in the flat grey light, fields and hedgerows and the occasional farmhouse with its lamp already lit against the early dark. We passed, at a certain point, through a stretch of higher ground from which the landscape opened briefly to the east. I was not thinking about Ravenscourt, but when the tower appeared, visible for perhaps 8 seconds at the limit of the window's angle, a dark vertical against a sky the colour of cold iron, rising above the tree line at the edge of the estate, I recognised it before I had consciously understood what I was looking at. It looked, from this distance and this angle, exactly as it had looked on the night of our arrival, ancient, indifferent, permanent. 500 years of stone, indifferent to the particular human grief that had accumulated at its foot. It would stand when Aldous Pembridge had served his sentence and been forgotten. It would stand when Clara had lived her life at Ravenscourt and passed the estate to whoever came after her. It would stand when Holmes and I were names in published accounts that no one read, and then when we were not even that. Towers built for grandeur, I had thought on the outward journey, have a habit of becoming monuments to grief. I had been right about that, and I had been wrong about the permanence of the grief. The grief, in this case, had been answered. Incompletely, imperfectly, in the way that all human justice is incomplete and imperfect, but answered nonetheless. The tower would remain. But what it meant now was different from what it had meant a week ago, and meaning is not stone, and it does not last 500 years unchanged. Holmes, I said. He opened one eye. The tower, I said. We just passed it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he closed his eye again. I know, he said. The train moved on through the November dark, south to north, away from Sussex and the sea, and the old house where Clara Pembridge was at that hour, sitting in her father's library with the recovered will on the desk before her, and the pale winter light coming in through the windows, and the silence of a large house that was, finally and irrevocably, hers. Holmes said nothing further, but after a moment in the warm compartment with the dark countryside moving past outside, he reached for his violin case from the rack above the seat, opened it, drew the bow slowly once across the strings, a single, quiet note that hung in the air of the compartment for a moment before the motion of the train absorbed it, and then set the instrument across his knees and closed his eyes again, and the train carried us north through the dark toward London. The case of the last letter from Ravenscourt was finished, or nearly so. The last letter, in the end, was not from Ravenscourt at all. It was from Clara, written in her own hand on her father's pale blue paper, telling us that she had climbed the tower and come back down, and was reading in the library and was going to be quite all right. That I have always thought was the right ending for it.